Charling Lee is a green building engineer in the sustainability group at the City of Vancouver, situated on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Charling has 15 years of experience in engineering, planning, and research roles in sustainable urban development and energy transition. And with that, we'll pass it to Charling Lee.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Next slide, please. Hi, so yes, my name is Charling Lee, and I'll start with a land acknowledgement. Again, I just wanted to acknowledge that the City of Vancouver is on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. This map here is from nativeland.ca, and it has the settlers' name turned off, but you can see that City of Vancouver is that peninsula kind of in the center of the map. The Indigenous names in gray lines show the various overlapping territories for the First Nations that have lived on these lands since millennia. And I really wanted to take a minute to honor and acknowledge the First Nation stewardship and care of these lands, and especially as we continue this discussion on climate risk and resilience, and while we're deepening our relationship with the land and the environment that sustains us, and as we're trying to move towards climate justice in our work. Next slide, please. So I'll just give some context for resilience in the City of Vancouver. In 2012, our council approved our first climate change adaptation strategy and updated in 2018. There are efforts from various groups within the city to address the different action areas, such as climate robust infrastructure, healthy and adaptive green space, community preparedness, coastal preparedness. The action area that I work in as part of this strategy is the priority for future-proof climate resilient building stock. So I'll focus on the building tools that on the policy tools that I'm working with in order to advance this priority, the Vancouver Building Bylaw and our rezoning policy. So last May, our council approved changes to our building bylaw to address the most pressing health and safety hazards for Vancouver, which are poor air quality from more wildfires and extreme heat. So the air filtration requirement addresses the first issue, while cooling in multifamily residential buildings addresses the second issue. And the second tool that we have at our disposal is a rezoning policy, which applies when projects are seeking additional densities than what current zoning allows. So since 2018, we've asked large developments to answer questions about the resilience of their project. Taking what we learned from these projects and summaries, we're setting up more structure for carrying out resilience assessments, and we're leaning on existing frameworks like the privacy high-level screening guide and BC's hazard risk and vulnerability analysis tool in creating this worksheet. Next slide, please. And I'll give you a little bit more context about the policy requirement for resilience assessment. So this is tied to a rezoning application. So this is very early days in schematic design of a building project. The majority of projects that are floor area that's being rezoned in the City of Vancouver is residential, and feedback tells us that resilience conversations in this sector particularly are not really being advanced. So as we're working on the next iteration of the resilience requirement, we want to address this issue by setting up the framework and the minimum expectations for what the resilience conversation should look like. We're creating a process based on the privacy high-level screening guide and a reporting format. And I'll just acknowledge that many BC public sector buildings have higher resilience assessments or design standards even. So this tool isn't really aimed at those projects. Those projects can just carry out their specific resilience assessments and provide us the report. They wouldn't have to step through our process. Next slide, please. Great. So what we've done as part of our assessment framework is we've set for industry what the building site and occupant scope is. We've got recommendations specific to the building industry around what the assessment team should look like. It should include all the design disciplines, the owners, and representatives of the building users and operators. We're recommending a workshop format. We're highlighting this as a qualitative assessment, and it really is a starting point for design teams to talk about risk and resilience. Next slide, please. And the goals of this assessment, like I mentioned, is really to add structure to consider resilience during current building design processes. So this requirement is for large new buildings. we're setting minimum expectations for assessments that are suited to the building scale and what can be known at the early design stage. Through projects having to meet this requirement, we're hoping that it raises awareness of climate risks changing over the building's life. We're still hearing a lot of feedback from industry where, conversations about what happens to the building during operation and near the end of life isn't really being had because of the nature of the market itself. And we're hoping that these assessments will help us evolve best practice for climate adaptation and identify, and most importantly, identify the barriers that projects are facing to give us, the City of Vancouver, feedback for any future policy code changes that we need to incorporate. Next slide, please. So I think most of you will be familiar with this definition of risk. I think it's adapted from high-level protocol. Our 4 steps that I'll go through in detail are an exposure screen, identifying the impacts, identifying the likelihood and risk, and identifying the resilience strategies that are applicable to the project. Next slide, please. So step 1, what we're asking projects to do is to decide on a qualitative level whether the project has no exposure, low, medium, or high exposure to the hazards. And we've given a framework for what the hazards are specific to the Vancouver context. And we're asking that all medium or high exposure hazards be moved on to the next steps. Next slide, please. And as a second step of identifying the impacts of the category, we are providing a list, a basic list of suggested impacted systems and elements that are applicable to the building scale. And we're encouraging teams to use this as a baseline, but of course add to it as they see fit. We're asking them to take a qualitative assessment of the consequences from a 1 to 5 scale. And at this step, we're asking them not to consider likelihood in this step because that'll be coming up in the next step. Please, next slide, thank you. And then in this step, we're using the qualitative likelihood scale from the PIVC high-level screening guide to evaluate how the hazard will change over the life of the building. We're asking projects teams to use internationally recognized climate projections and conservative scenarios. And like many of you are aware, that will give you a risk rating. Next slide, please. And finally, the last step in our process is we're asking that all projects with all the medium and high risks identified in the projects to identify what the possible strategies are to mitigate those risks. We want them to tell us which strategies will be included in the design, which strategies will be explored for future adoption, something that maybe they can address through the design process, through the design of the building, that maybe it's something that can only be considered in construction or operation of the building. We want the teams to tell us how or when will the information be passed along and who may be responsible for the strategy. And for strategies that are applicable to the project but are not being implemented now or considered for future, tell us why not. What are the barriers that exist? In order to give us feedback and help the industry figure out what are some of the really applicable strategies to the building stock, and why can't we do them? Last step. Last slide, thank you. So as I mentioned, we're working on a resilience worksheet that's currently in process. What that really looks like is an Excel tool with 4 or 5 tabs, very similar to the high-level screening guide, different color schemes, and a page for reporting all of the high risks and high, medium risk and the strategies that are applicable and what's being done and what's not being done. And I want to highlight here that there are a number of resources out there already for the building context and for the BC building context. We know what the resilience strategies are. The gap that we see and what we're trying to address is the understanding of the hazards, how they apply to your specific project, and how the hazards change over time, and prioritizing the risks. And so this is one of our tools to really move the conversation forward to adopt the strategies that work for the project and help us move code and policy along. And that is it for me. Thank you. Oh, and there's my information. I can't stick around for the panel discussion, unfortunately, but please email me with any questions as you need to. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Charling.